When we hear the word communism, it often evokes strong images and emotions, images of workers standing together, ideas of a society where everyone is equal, and the dream of a world without poverty. But what does communism really mean? And why has it captured the imagination of millions around the globe for over a century? In today's video, we are diving deep into the origins and principles of communist ideology, exploring its theoretical goals, and asking, despite its noble ideals, it has struggled to succeed in practice. At its communism is built on the idea that all people should be treated equally, and that the wealth of a nation should belong to everyone, not just a privileged few. The theory promotes collective ownership, meaning land, factories, and resources are managed for the benefit of society as a whole rather than individual profit. It is a vision where social classes disappear, and everyone has access to education, healthcare, and the basic necessities of life. The promise is bold: a world without hunger, without exploitation, and without the stark inequalities we often see in capitalist societies. The roots of this ideology can be traced back to the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who argued that history is essentially a struggle between classes. According to them, the working class, the people who actually produce goods and services, has always been exploited by the owning class. Communism, in their view, was the solution, a system where the working class would collectively own the means of production, abolishing private property in favor of communal wealth. It was a revolutionary idea, one that inspired uprisings, revolutions, and the creation of states attempting to put these theories into practice. Yet, as we explore the story of communism, it is important to remember the difference between theory and reality. The ideals are undeniably compelling, painting a picture of a fair and just society where everyone has an equal chance to thrive. It is easy to see why millions have been drawn to this vision, dreaming of a society where no one is left behind, where the gap between rich and poor vanishes, and where community and cooperation replace competition and greed. In this video series, we will not only look at the principles of communism, but also examine the historical attempts to implement it. We will explore the successes, the failures, and the lessons learned along the way, from the rise of the Soviet Union to the experiments in China, Cuba, and beyond. We will uncover how the lofty ideals of communism clashed with the realities of governing, human nature, and economic management. So if you are curious about the story behind one of history's most influential and controversial ideologies, make sure you stick around. Don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoy this deep dive into history, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the upcoming episodes where we break down the fatal flaws and surprising insights of communism. Let us explore together why an idea so powerful in theory has struggled to survive in the real world. As we continue our journey through the world of communist ideology, it is impossible to overlook one of the most persistent and challenging issues that arose when theory met reality: central planning. At first glance, the idea seems perfectly logical. If a nation's resources, factories, and farms are managed by a single central authority, then in theory, everything can be allocated efficiently to meet the needs of all citizens, avoiding waste and ensuring fairness. The vision was seductive: a society where no one goes hungry, where every family has access to the essentials, and where economic stability is guaranteed by careful, deliberate planning. Leaders and economists who designed these systems promised that by coordinating every aspect of production and distribution, society could eliminate the chaos and unpredictability of markets and private enterprise. However, as history has repeatedly shown, the reality of central planning proved far more complicated. Rather than creating a smooth, harmonious flow of goods and services, many centrally planned economies ended up struggling with chronic shortages and misallocation. Factories might produce too much of one item and not nearly enough of another, leaving store shelves either overflowing with useless goods or completely empty of essentials. Entire communities could find themselves waiting weeks, even months, for basic necessities like bread, meat, or household supplies. While the theory assumed that a central authority could foresee the needs of millions of people, the scale and complexity of real life were far beyond the ability of planners to accurately predict. The problem was not simply mismanagement on the part of individuals, though that played a role, but rather a structural challenge inherent to the system itself. Information about local demand, individual preferences, and regional production capacities was often incomplete, outdated, or impossible to process in a timely manner. When a factory received quotas from the Central Planning Office, it followed them as strictly as possible, prioritizing meeting targets over responding to actual demand. The result was a constant mismatch between what was produced and what people actually needed. A classic example comes from the Soviet Union, where factories would report achievements in meeting production quotas, while the goods themselves were of poor quality or entirely unsellable, and citizens would endure empty shelves for items that were theoretically abundant somewhere in the system. This disconnect between planning and reality also led to inventive but often desperate solutions. People learned to navigate shortages through informal networks, bartering, and even black markets. While these workarounds allowed individuals to survive, they revealed the cracks in the system and undermined the authority of the very structures meant to guarantee equality. What began as a noble goal to ensure that everyone had access to what they needed often ended up creating frustration, inefficiency, and a sense that the system was out of touch with daily life. Furthermore, central planning discouraged flexibility and innovation. When every decision was dictated from the top, there was little room for local managers or workers to adjust production in response to unforeseen circumstances. A poor harvest, a sudden spike in demand, or a new technological opportunity could not be responded to quickly, because all decisions had to travel through layers of bureaucracy. The rigidity of the system meant that even minor disruptions could snowball into larger crises, affecting millions. Whereas market-based economies rely on price signals and competition to balance supply and demand, centrally planned economies lacked these feedback mechanisms, leaving planners blind to the changing needs of the population until it was too late. Ironically, the very mechanism meant to ensure fairness and abundance often contributed to scarcity and dissatisfaction. Resources were not always allocated where they were most needed, but where political influence or bureaucratic convenience dictated. Priority was sometimes given to heavy industry or military production at the expense of consumer goods, reflecting the ideological goals of the state rather than the practical needs of its citizens. Over time, this imbalance eroded public trust, as people came to understand that the promises of abundance and equality were being undermined not by ideology alone, but by the inherent difficulties of implementing it on a large scale. In exploring the challenges of central planning, we also see how these economic inefficiencies were intertwined with human experiences. Stories from ordinary citizens illustrate the daily realities of life under these systems. Families rationing food, standing in long lines for basic goods, and constantly adapting to shortages that seemed almost absurd in their predictability. At the same time, planners and officials often celebrated production figures in reports that concealed the hardships faced by the public, highlighting a disconnect between the idealized version of communism and the lived experience of those it was supposed to serve. This tension between vision and reality is a recurring theme in the history of communism. Central planning was not a flaw in the enthusiasm or commitment of those who believed in equality. Rather, it was an inherent challenge in trying to control every aspect of a complex society from a single center. While the goals were admirable, eliminating poverty, ensuring fairness, and providing for all the mechanisms often failed to deliver on these promises, creating a gap between theory and practice that would shape the trajectory of communist states for decades. As we continue to explore the fatal flaws of communism, understanding the story of central planning is essential. It reminds us that even the most well-intentioned ideas can falter when confronted with the complexity of human society, the unpredictability of needs, and the limitations of information and administration. If you are finding this journey through history enlightening, do not forget to give this video a like, and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you can follow along as we uncover more lessons from the past, exploring both the ideals and the realities that shaped one of the most ambitious experiments in human governance. Together, we will see how the promise of equality often collided with the practical challenges of managing resources, and what that clash can teach us about the delicate balance between vision and implementation. As we delve deeper into the story of communism, it becomes clear that the challenges of central planning were only part of a larger pattern, one that touched every level of society and shaped the everyday experiences of millions. While central authorities attempted to allocate resources and direct production with precision, another subtle yet powerful problem emerged, one that struck at the very heart of human motivation. In systems where equality was enforced and rewards were largely standardized, workers and managers often found themselves stripped of the personal incentives that drive innovation, productivity, and excellence. What seemed at first like an inspiring vision of collective effort gradually revealed itself to be a more complex and human struggle, where the ideal of equality sometimes undermined the very performance it sought to encourage. Imagine a factory where every worker receives the same wage, regardless of whether they produce 10 units or 100, regardless of whether they innovate to improve efficiency or simply follow instructions. In such an environment, the natural rewards for hard work, ingenuity, and dedication are minimized. When effort does not translate into personal benefit, the incentive to push beyond the minimum diminishes. It is not that people are inherently lazy, but rather that the system provides little reason to take initiative or assume extra responsibility. Over time, this lack of motivation seeps into the culture of the workplace, shaping attitudes, habits, and expectations in ways that planners and theorists rarely anticipated. Managers, too, were caught in the same web of constraints. In a centrally planned economy, their role often becomes one of compliance rather than leadership. Their success is measured not by how effectively they meet the needs of their community or customers, but by their ability to meet targets set by distant bureaucrats. Creativity, problem solving, and the pursuit of efficiency may even be discouraged, because deviation from the plan can be interpreted as failure or negligence. Consequently, managerial innovation, the ability to improve processes, motivate teams, and respond to unforeseen challenges, becomes stifled, leaving the entire system rigid and slow to adapt. This dynamic created a cycle that was difficult to break. When workers and managers had little incentive to excel, overall productivity suffered. When productivity suffered, shortages and inefficiencies became more pronounced, reinforcing the perception that the system was struggling. These challenges, in turn, demanded even more oversight, stricter quotas, and additional bureaucratic control, further reducing autonomy and creativity. The very mechanisms designed to ensure fairness and equality inadvertently suppressed the individual initiative that might have alleviated some of the system's difficulties. Historical examples illustrate this vividly. In Soviet factories, reports would often boast of impressive production figures, yet a closer look frequently revealed that quality had been sacrificed for quantity, and many goods were unusable or poorly made. Employees would do just enough to meet quotas, while those who attempted to innovate risked reprimand for deviating from instructions. In Maoist China, similar patterns emerged, with massive campaigns to mobilize the population often resulting in impressive numbers on paper but little genuine improvement in productivity or living standards. Workers and managers were trapped in a system that rewarded conformity and punished initiative, demonstrating how structural incentives or the lack thereof can shape human behavior as powerfully as ideology itself. Yet, beyond the numbers and policies, the human stories are equally telling. Ordinary citizens often recount a sense of frustration and futility, describing days spent performing repetitive tasks that seemed disconnected from any real impact. Efforts that went unnoticed and unrewarded. Talented individuals sometimes abandoned projects or moved into less demanding roles. Recognizing that ambition and ingenuity were not valued, communities adapted in small ways, creating informal networks or cooperative arrangements. But these efforts were fragmented and limited in scope, unable to compensate for the systemic constraints imposed by the broader economic model. The consequences extended beyond the workplace into society at large. When citizens perceive that effort and talent are neither recognized nor rewarded, participation in civic life, entrepreneurship, and local problem-solving may decline. Innovation slows, risk-taking diminishes, and the vibrancy of social and economic life can wane. The promise of communism, a society where collective effort leads to shared prosperity, clashes with a human reality. People are motivated not just by ideals but by the tangible outcomes of their labor. And when these outcomes are muted, so too is the drive to excel. In understanding this aspect of communism, we see a recurring theme: the tension between noble ideals and human behavior. The goal of equality, implemented without careful consideration of incentives and motivation, can unintentionally suppress the very qualities that enable a society to thrive. Central planning may struggle with allocation, but even when resources exist, the system's design can make it difficult for individuals to act with initiative. Creativity, or personal drive, it is a subtle flaw, not always visible in official reports or ideological arguments, but one that profoundly shaped the experiences of millions and contributed to the long-term challenges faced by communist states. As we reflect on these lessons, it becomes clear that understanding communism requires looking beyond slogans and theories to the lived realities of people within these systems. The story of motivation, or the lack thereof, illuminates why even a society with abundant resources and ambitious plans can encounter persistent inefficiencies and unmet needs. If you are finding this exploration of history compelling, remember to hit the like button to support the channel and subscribe so you do not miss our next episodes, where we continue to uncover how the ideals of communism intersected with human nature, revealing both the promise and the pitfalls of one of the most ambitious social experiments in modern history. By examining these stories, we gain a richer understanding not only of the past, but also of the delicate balance between vision, structure, and the incentives that drive human action. As we follow the unfolding story of communism, the narrative moves beyond the economic struggles and the challenges of human motivation to a dimension that touches every corner of society: the relationship between political control and the pursuit of equality. From the earliest revolutionary moments, communist leaders envisioned a society in which no individual would rise above another in wealth or privilege, and in which the needs of the collective would take precedence over personal ambition. While these ideals were inspiring in theory, the mechanisms chosen to enforce them often brought about intense political oversight, strict control of information, and widespread censorship, shaping daily life in ways that were both visible and invisible, subtle and profound. The drive to create equality often required leaders to establish centralized authority not just over factories, farms, and resources, but over ideas, speech, and cultural expression. When the state becomes the arbiter of fairness, it must, in practice, Define what constitutes acceptable thought and behavior. In an environment where every citizen is expected to conform to the same ideals, dissent is seen not merely as disagreement, but as a threat to the collective vision. As a result, censorship and surveillance emerged as tools to maintain control, to ensure that the narrative of progress and unity was preserved, and that nothing undermined the ideological cohesion deemed essential for the Project's survival. This dynamic is deeply intertwined with the economic and motivational challenges we have explored. Central planning, while theoretically ensuring resources for all, relies on accurate reporting and compliance from those carrying out the work, and productivity suffers if workers and managers lack personal incentive to enforce participation and alignment with goals. Political oversight becomes increasingly intrusive. Citizens are not only expected to meet production quotas and follow regulations, but to demonstrate ideological commitment, to speak, write, and act in ways that affirm the state's vision. This fusion of economic control and political surveillance creates an environment in which fear, self-censorship, and conformity begin to shape behavior as much as laws or policies themselves. The consequences of this control ripple through society. Artists, writers, and thinkers often find themselves restricted, unable to explore ideas freely without risking censure. Universities, media outlets, and even community organizations are pressured to echo official narratives, sometimes producing work that aligns more with political expedience than with curiosity. Innovation, or truth. Ordinary citizens, aware that deviations from prescribed norms could carry severe penalties, begin to moderate their own behavior and speech. A quiet tension emerges, where loyalty is measured not just by actions but by conformity, where creativity is suppressed in favor of stability, and where the public sphere becomes increasingly uniform and regulated. Historical examples illustrate the depth of this phenomenon. In the Soviet Union, political control reached into nearly every aspect of daily life, with extensive surveillance networks, controlled media, and campaigns to eliminate dissenting voices. Intellectuals and professionals were often compelled to produce work that aligned with state ideology, and those who failed to do so risked exclusion, imprisonment, or worse. In Maoist China, similar patterns emerged, particularly during periods such as the Cultural Revolution, when deviation from prescribed thought was treated as dangerous, and public and private life alike were subject to scrutiny. The rhetoric of equality and collective well-being often masked a complex machinery of control that limited personal freedom in the name of social justice. Yet, while these measures were presented as necessary to achieve equality, they also introduced profound tension between the state and its citizens. People were caught between the promise of a society free from class distinctions and the reality of living under constant oversight. Compliance became a survival strategy, but it also eroded trust, stifled innovation, and created an environment in which genuine discussion, debate, and problem-solving were discouraged. The society envisioned in theory a community bound together by shared goals and mutual support frequently became one in which fear and caution shaped every interaction, where ambition and curiosity were tempered by the need to avoid scrutiny. This interplay between political control and societal equality also reinforces lessons from earlier chapters of our story. Just as central planning struggled with misallocation of resources, and just as standardized rewards dampened motivation, the imposition of strict ideological control further complicated the practical implementation of communism. Each of these challenges did not exist in isolation. They were interconnected threads in the broader tapestry of an ambitious social experiment. Economic inefficiency, lack of incentive, and political oversight combined to create systems that often fell short of the lofty ideals they promised. Understanding the role of censorship and political control helps illuminate why communism, despite its powerful vision, frequently face such persistent obstacles. It reminds us that the enforcement of ideals, no matter how noble, carries consequences that extend beyond policy into the fabric of everyday life. It also demonstrates that the pursuit of equality, when intertwined with authority, can create environments where freedom, creativity, and personal expression are constrained, revealing the tension between collective goals and individual liberties. As we continue to explore the complexities of communism, it is essential to see these elements not as isolated failures, but as part of a larger story in which ideology, human behavior, and structural design intersect in profound ways. If you are finding this exploration into history compelling, be sure to hit the like button to show your support and subscribe to the channel so you can follow along as we uncover more episodes that reveal the intricate balance between ideals, governance, and the realities of daily life. Through these stories, we gain a richer understanding of how the pursuit of equality, when enforced through political control and censorship, shaped the lived experiences of millions, and why the promise of a perfect society often collided with the complexities of human nature. As we continue to follow the complex story of communism, it becomes increasingly clear that the combination of central planning, diminished personal motivation, and strict political oversight created not only economic inefficiencies and social rigidity, but also fertile ground for corruption. While the ideology promised equality and fairness, the concentration of power in the hands of a few officials, combined with a lack of transparency and accountability, often allowed individuals to manipulate the system for personal gain, sometimes at the expense of the very people they were meant to serve. This dynamic added yet another layer to the challenges faced by communist states, illustrating how even well-intentioned structures can produce unintended consequences. In a society governed by centralized decision-making, officials are entrusted with immense authority over the allocation of resources, distribution of goods, and enforcement of policies. The ideal is that these leaders act selflessly, guided by the principles of equality and collective welfare, ensuring that every factory, farm, and office functions efficiently and fairly. In practice, however, absolute power without effective oversight often breeds self-interest. When a single official controls the flow of food, housing, or raw materials, the temptation to divert resources, manipulate reports, or exploit connections can be difficult to resist. What was meant to be a fair and impartial system can easily become a hierarchy where favoritism, bribery, and abuse of power flourish, undermining both the ideals and the functionality of the state. Historical examples offer vivid illustrations of this phenomenon. In the Soviet Union, the vast bureaucracy overseeing every sector of the economy created opportunities for officials to manipulate production reports, siphon resources, and secure privileges unavailable to ordinary citizens. Factories reported inflated numbers to meet quotas, warehouses stored goods that were later misappropriated, and those in positions of authority could leverage their control to enrich themselves or protect allies. The very structure designed to enforce equality paradoxically created inequalities, as officials enjoyed access to better housing, food, and services while the broader population faced shortages and hardship. In Maoist China, similar patterns emerged, particularly during campaigns intended to mobilize the population for ambitious industrial or agricultural goals. Local party leaders, tasked with meeting targets set by distant authorities, sometimes falsified statistics or diverted supplies, prioritizing personal survival and status over collective welfare, revealing a recurring tension between ideology and human behavior. These instances of corruption were not merely economic distortions, they had profound social and psychological effects. Ordinary citizens, witnessing officials live in comfort while queues formed outside empty stores, experienced disillusionment and resentment. Trust in the system eroded, and the moral authority of the state, which relied on the promise of fairness, began to crumble. Corruption became a hidden force that influenced daily life, shaping interactions, expectations, and strategies for survival. People learned to navigate informal networks, trade favors, or participate in small acts of deception themselves, reinforcing a cycle in which the rules of the system were manipulated to serve individual interests rather than collective goals. The emergence of corruption in centralized systems also highlights a deeper structural challenge. Concentration of power, even when justified by ideology, reduces checks and balances and limits accountability. In decentralized or market-based systems, competition, transparency, and the diffuse nature of authority create natural barriers to abuse. When power is concentrated, these barriers are removed, and oversight becomes difficult, if not impossible. Even well-meaning officials can find themselves caught in networks of expectation, obligation, and self-preservation, where bending the rules seems necessary to achieve targets or maintain position. The consequences ripple outward, affecting production, resource distribution, and social cohesion, and feeding back into the economic inefficiencies and motivational challenges we explored earlier. Yet, it is important to recognize that corruption in centralized systems is not simply the result of individual moral failings, it is deeply intertwined with the design of the system itself. By granting officials extraordinary authority without independent mechanisms for accountability or public scrutiny, the structures intended to enforce equality inadvertently provide the tools for inequality. Reports meant to measure productivity can be manipulated, supplies intended for the community can be redirected, and enforcement mechanisms intended to maintain fairness can be exploited. In this way, the very architecture of centralized control becomes a double-edged sword, promising stability and uniformity while simultaneously enabling deviation and exploitation. The human dimension of these stories is striking. Accounts from citizens living under these systems reveal frustration, resignation, and ingenuity. People adapted to shortages and misallocation through personal networks, bartering, or informal economies, demonstrating resilience in the face of systemic inefficiencies. Meanwhile, officials navigating the complex hierarchy of central authority faced pressure from above and temptation from within, creating an environment in which ethical compromises were often seen as necessary for survival or advancement. The interplay of ideology, human behavior, and systemic design created a dynamic in which corruption was not an anomaly but a predictable outcome of the structures themselves. Understanding this aspect of communism helps explain why so many of its experiments struggled to achieve their goals. Centralized authority promised fairness, equality, and shared prosperity, but the lack of transparency, accountability, and incentives created opportunities for abuse. These abuses, in turn, deepened economic and social inequalities, eroded trust, and further complicated the task of governing effectively. It is a vivid reminder that the success of any political or economic system depends not only on its ideals but on the mechanisms that guide human behavior. Distribute authority and ensure accountability. As we continue exploring the fatal flaws of communism, it becomes clear that corruption, like central planning inefficiencies and demotivated workers, is part of a larger pattern of challenges that emerge when ideology intersects with human nature and structural design. If you are enjoying this journey into history, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss upcoming episodes, where we uncover how these systemic issues shaped the lives of millions and why the promise of a perfect society often collided with the realities of power, ambition, and human behavior. By examining these stories closely, we gain insight into the delicate balance required to build a society that aspires to fairness while contending with the complexities of human nature. As we move further into the exploration of communism, the theoretical ideals and structural challenges we have discussed come to life most vividly through historical case studies, examining the experiences of the Soviet Union, Maoist China, and other regimes provides a lens to understand how central planning, lack of incentives, political control, and opportunities for corruption translated into real-world consequences, often revealing systemic failures that contrasted sharply with the utopian visions so many believed in. These stories are not merely historical footnotes. They are windows into the human, economic, and political complexities that arise when ideology meets reality, showing how the noble ambitions of equality and collective welfare often clashed with practical implementation. In the Soviet Union, the first major experiment in large-scale communism, the state sought to restructure every facet of society, from industry and agriculture to education and culture. The early years after the revolution were marked by a sense of idealism and urgency, as leaders aimed to abolish private property, redistribute wealth, and create a society that served all citizens rather than an elite few. Yet, even as factories were nationalized and 5-year plans were implemented to boost production, fundamental challenges emerge. Central planning, while theoretically ensuring that resources were allocated according to need, frequently led to mismatches between supply and demand. Factories produced massive quantities of goods, yet the quality was often poor, and basic necessities were scarce. Citizens found themselves navigating empty shelves and long lines for items that, according to official reports, should have been plentiful. The tension between ideological ambition and logistical reality was amplified by the rigidity of the planning system, which left little room for local managers to respond to changing circumstances or innovate solutions, creating an environment where inefficiency became almost inevitable. Maoist China presents another dramatic illustration of systemic failure, albeit shaped by its own unique context and historical trajectory. During campaigns such as the Great Leap Forward, the government sought to rapidly transform China from an agrarian society into an industrial powerhouse. Peasants were organized into collective farms. Backyard furnaces were constructed to produce steel, and ambitious production targets were set without regard to local conditions or expertise. In theory, these policies were meant to elevate the nation collectively, to lift millions out of poverty, and to demonstrate the power of a society united under a shared ideology. In practice, however, the results were catastrophic. Poor planning, lack of realistic incentives, and political pressure to meet targets led to widespread misreporting of output, misallocation of resources, and ultimately one of the deadliest famines in human history. Millions of people suffered and perished as a result, highlighting the human cost of rigid ideology when divorced from practical considerations and checks on authority. Other regimes, from Cuba to Eastern European states, also offer compelling examples of systemic failure under communism. In each, we observe recurring patterns. Ambitious goals set by central authorities clash with local realities. Incentives for individual and managerial effort are muted. Political control limits personal freedom, and opportunities for corruption emerge as officials navigate a complex and often contradictory system. These patterns are not random. They are structural consequences of the design choices inherent to highly centralized, ideologically driven governance. In many instances, the official narrative emphasized success, progress, and equality, yet the lived experience of citizens told a different story, one of frustration, improvisation, and compromise. Families endured shortages, workers navigated bureaucratic hurdles, and communities adapted in small ways to survive within systems that frequently failed to meet their needs. The lessons from these case studies extend beyond the specific historical circumstances of the Soviet Union or Maoist China. They reveal the delicate balance between ideology, human behavior, and structural design, illustrating how even the most ambitious visions can be undermined by practical realities. Centralized power, while intended to ensure fairness and efficiency, can create bottlenecks, distort incentives, and provide opportunities for abuse. Policies that assume uniformity of motivation and capacity across millions of individuals often encounter unforeseen obstacles. The pursuit of equality, when enforced through strict political oversight and rigid planning, can clash with personal initiative and local knowledge, resulting in systemic inefficiencies that are difficult to correct. Moreover, these historical examples underscore the human dimension of systemic failure. It is not just the numbers or production statistics that reveal the shortcomings of communism, but the lived experiences of ordinary people, the line of peasants waiting for grain that never arrives, the factory worker producing goods that will never be used, the manager forced to falsify reports to meet unrealistic quotas, and the citizens navigating a society where political loyalty and conformity often outweigh competence and creativity. The tension between ideal and reality manifests in daily life, shaping culture, expectations, and relationships in ways that persist long after policies are enacted or regimes fall. By weaving together these narratives, we see that the failures of communism are not confined to isolated incidents or particular countries, but emerge from recurring dynamics inherent in the system itself. Central planning, lack of incentives, political control, and corruption interact to create environments in which even well-intentioned policies can produce unintended consequences. The Soviet Union, Maoist China, and other regimes offer a rich tapestry of examples, illustrating both the promise and peril of attempting to reshape society according to ideological principles. They reveal the limits of human organization, the complexities of motivation, and the consequences of concentrating authority in ways that bypass the checks and balances that sustain flexibility and accountability. As we continue our exploration, these case studies serve as a vital reference point, allowing us to trace the connections between theory and practice, between vision and outcome. If you are enjoying this historical journey and want to understand how ideas translate or sometimes fail to translate into reality, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. By following these stories, we gain insight into the intricate interplay between ideology, human behavior, and governance, learning not just about the history of communism, but about the enduring challenges of building societies that aspire to fairness, prosperity, and collective well-being while navigating the complexities of human nature. As we continue unraveling the story of communism, it becomes impossible to ignore the human cost of the systemic flaws we have explored. Central planning created inefficiencies, lack of incentives reduced productivity, political control stifled freedom, and opportunities for corruption thrived. But perhaps the most tragic consequence of these intertwined issues was the suffering inflicted upon ordinary citizens through famines, purges, and repression. While the ideology promised equality, collective prosperity, and a better life for all, the reality in many communist states revealed a stark contrast. Millions of lives disrupted or lost as the machinery of governance clashed with the complexity of human society. In the Soviet Union, the early decades after the revolution illustrate how ambitious policies, driven by a desire to rapidly transform society, could spiral into catastrophe. The forced collectivization of agriculture in the late 1920s and early 1930s aimed to consolidate small farms into large, state-controlled collectives, theoretically increasing efficiency and ensuring that food was distributed equitably. In practice, The policy ignored the realities of local conditions. Climate variability and traditional farming knowledge. Peasants were forced off their land, livestock was confiscated, and resistance was met with harsh repression. The resulting disruptions to food production, combined with unrealistic quotas imposed on collective farms, led to one of the most devastating famines in human history. Millions perished, not because of natural scarcity alone, but because of policies implemented without regard for the complexity of life on the ground, and enforced through uncompromising state power. Maoist China offers a similarly sobering example. During the Great Leap Forward, the government sought to industrialize rapidly while collectivizing agriculture, believing that ambitious targets could propel China toward prosperity. Peasants were organized into communal farms, and backyard steel furnaces sprang up across villages in an attempt to demonstrate industrial prowess. But the top-down mandates failed to reflect local realities. Crops were mismanaged, harvests were misreported, and food was diverted to urban centers or exported to meet political goals. Famine swept across the countryside, with tens of millions of people dying from starvation. In addition, attempts to suppress dissent meant that those who dared to report the truth about crop failures risked punishment, creating a climate in which misinformation compounded human suffering, the very mechanisms designed to enforce equality and collective success. Through authoritarian oversight and strict adherence to ideological targets, amplified the scale of the disaster. Purges were another manifestation of the deadly consequences of authoritarian enforcement. In the Soviet Union under Stalin, political purges targeted perceived enemies, dissenters, and even loyal citizens whose loyalty or usefulness was questioned. Party officials, intellectuals, and ordinary workers found themselves accused of sabotage, espionage, or counter-revolutionary behavior, often on the basis of flimsy evidence or political expediency. Trials were swift, sentences harsh, and executions frequent, creating an atmosphere of fear that permeated daily life. The purges were not random acts of cruelty. They were often justified as necessary to protect the revolution and enforce ideological conformity. Yet the human cost was staggering, as millions were imprisoned, exiled, or executed, and the social fabric of communities was irreparably damaged. Families were torn apart, and the sense of security and trust within society eroded under the weight of constant surveillance and suspicion. In China, similar patterns emerged during the Cultural Revolution, when the enforcement of ideological purity led to widespread persecution, public humiliation, and even violence against those deemed insufficiently loyal to the party line. Schools, universities, and workplaces were swept by campaigns targeting intellectuals, professionals, and cultural figures, while citizens were encouraged to report on neighbors or colleagues. The disruption extended beyond immediate victims, affecting communities and institutions for years to come, as fear and mistrust became entrenched, and social cohesion was undermined by the constant pressure to conform. Even beyond these two examples, other communist regimes experienced similar tragedies, illustrating that these outcomes were not anomalies but recurrent patterns arising from structural features of authoritarian governance. When policies are implemented without effective feedback mechanisms, when dissent is suppressed, and when the state seeks to enforce ideals through coercion, the risk of catastrophic mismanagement rises. Famines, purges, and repression were not simply the result of bad luck or individual misjudgment. They were the product of systemic choices, amplified by the concentration of power and the rigid enforcement of ideological objectives. The human dimension of these tragedies is particularly poignant. Stories of families struggling to survive, of communities decimated by starvation or forced labor, and of individuals living under constant threat of accusation, illustrate the profound disconnect between ideological aspiration and lived reality. The promise of equality, shared prosperity, and a better life collided with a system that, in its pursuit of perfection and compliance, often inflicted suffering on those it was supposed to uplift. These narratives remind us that policies are not abstract concepts. They ripple through the lives of people, shaping experiences, relationships, and opportunities in profound ways. Reflecting on famines, purges, and repression allows us to see communism not just as a set of ideas, but as a series of real-world experiments with consequences that were often as harsh as they were unintended. Central planning, demotivated labor, political control, and corruption combined to create environments where human suffering could escalate, where communities could be destabilized, and where the costs of ideological ambition were measured in lives lost and freedoms curtailed. As we continue exploring the fatal flaws of communism, these stories serve as a reminder that understanding history requires attention not only to policies and economic theory, but to the human realities they shape. If you are finding this journey into history compelling, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you can follow along as we uncover more episodes, revealing how the pursuit of ideals, when enforced through rigid and authoritarian structures, can produce outcomes far removed from the noble vision that inspired them. By examining these tragedies closely, we gain insight into the delicate balance required to govern effectively while striving for equality and justice, and the consequences when that balance is lost. As we examine the history of communism, it becomes increasingly clear that the flaws we have discussed, central planning, lack of incentives, political control, corruption, and the human cost of misguided policies were compounded by an equally critical challenge: resistance to reform. The very structures that were intended to enforce equality and ideological purity often made adaptation nearly impossible, creating stagnant systems unable to respond to economic shifts. Technological advances, or changing social realities. In every corner of the Soviet Union, Maoist China, and other communist regimes, we see the consequences of inflexibility, as governments clung to outdated models, resisted pragmatic adjustments, and punished those who suggested alternative approaches, all in the name of preserving the ideology that defined the state. The Soviet Union provides a particularly vivid example of how resistance to reform can stifle progress. Following decades of centralization and rigid planning, the leadership faced an economy increasingly unable to meet the needs of its citizens. Shortages persisted. Industries lagged behind global technological advances, and inefficiencies became deeply embedded in the system. Yet, attempts to introduce meaningful reforms often met fierce opposition within the political hierarchy. Leaders feared that any deviation from the party line would undermine the ideological foundations of the state, threaten their authority, or signal weakness to both domestic and international observers. The result was a system that continued to operate according to outdated quotas, obsolete production methods, and rigid bureaucratic procedures, leaving the country ill-prepared to compete in a rapidly changing global economy. Resistance to reform also manifested in the suppression of ideas and the marginalization of those advocating for change. Economists, engineers, and managers who recognized the need for adaptation often found their proposals ignored, delayed, or outright censored. Innovation was discouraged not only because it challenged established procedures, but because it threatened the narrative of ideological perfection that the state sought to maintain. Those who questioned policies were sometimes accused of disloyalty, subversion, or undermining the revolution itself, creating an environment in which prudent adaptation was equated with ideological betrayal. The consequences were profound. Industries stagnated. Agricultural output remained inconsistent, and citizens continued to experience shortages and inefficiencies that might have been alleviated by relatively modest reforms. China faced similar challenges, particularly after the catastrophic consequences of the Great Leap Forward became apparent. While some leaders recognized the need to adjust policies to prevent further famine and social unrest, entrenched political structures and ideological rigidity slowed the process. Local officials were often reluctant to report problems accurately, fearing political repercussions, while central authorities were hesitant to admit that long-held strategies had failed. As a result, policy shifts were often reactive and uneven, rather than proactive and systematic, and the nation struggled to recover from the combined effects of poor planning, mass mobilization campaigns, and social upheaval. Resistance to reform, therefore, was not merely a matter of stubbornness, it was embedded in the incentives, pressures, and fears that shaped decision-making within a centralized, authoritarian system. Other communist regimes across Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and Latin America exhibited similar patterns, underscoring a structural truth: systems that centralize authority, enforce conformity, and prioritize ideological purity over pragmatic problem-solving are inherently resistant to change. Even when reform promises the potential for improvement, the political and bureaucratic costs of deviation from established procedures are often so high that leaders choose inertia over adaptation. Over time, this stagnation compounds, leaving societies ill-equipped to respond to technological shifts, economic crises, or evolving social demands. While central planning may function in theory during periods of stability, the inability to reform ensures that crises, whether economic, environmental, or social, become magnified, producing consequences that ripple through communities and generations. The human dimension of resistance to reform is both subtle and pervasive. Ordinary citizens often experience the effects as frustration, scarcity, or diminished opportunity. Skilled workers, managers, and professionals see their suggestions ignored or punished, fostering disengagement and discouraging initiative. Over time, these attitudes contribute to a culture of passivity, where individuals become resigned to inefficiency and shortages because the system seems unchangeable. The result is a society in which stagnation is not just structural but cultural, as the fear of reprisal and the lack of incentive suppress creativity, entrepreneurship, and problem-solving. The lessons of history show that even small opportunities for adaptation, if resisted, can have cascading effects on productivity, innovation, and overall societal well-being. Resistance to reform also intersects with the other flaws we have discussed. Centralized planning magnifies the consequences of inflexibility, because decisions must travel through layers of bureaucracy. Lack of motivation among workers and managers reduces the likelihood that individuals will advocate for change. Political control and censorship limit the flow of information necessary to identify problems and solutions, while opportunities for corruption can entrench vested interests that oppose reform. Together, these factors create a feedback loop in which stagnation becomes self-reinforcing, and the very structures intended to achieve equality and prosperity instead impede progress, eroding both efficiency and public trust. Understanding the consequences of resisting reform provides a deeper insight into why communism, despite its ideological aspirations, often struggled to meet the practical needs of its citizens. History demonstrates that even the most ambitious social experiments require flexibility, responsiveness, and openness to new ideas. Without these, policies that once seemed promising can ossify into mechanisms of stagnation, producing outcomes that contradict the ideals they were meant to serve. If you are following this journey through the history of communism, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you can continue exploring how structural rigidity, ideological enforcement, and resistance to reform shaped societies and human lives across decades. By examining these stories, we gain not only an understanding of the failures of past systems, but also a lens through which to appreciate the importance of adaptability, transparency, and human initiative in any effort to organize and govern society. Through these lessons, the past informs the present, revealing the intricate balance between ideals, practical governance, and the necessity of change in a dynamic world. As we draw the narrative of communism closer to the present, it becomes evident that the combination of central planning inefficiencies, demotivated workforces, political control, corruption, human suffering, and resistance to reform set the stage for the eventual transformations or collapses of many communist states. Despite the lofty ideals that once inspired revolutions and campaigns, the lived reality of these societies increasingly revealed the limits of centralized control and rigid ideology. Over time, millions of citizens experienced shortages, inefficiencies, and social constraints that could not be entirely resolved within the structures initially created to enforce equality, leading to profound political, economic, and social consequences that ultimately reshaped entire nations. The Soviet Union stands as perhaps the most emblematic example of this trajectory. For decades, the state attempted to manage every facet of the economy through central planning, while suppressing dissent and controlling information in the name of ideological cohesion. Yet, as we have seen, structural inefficiencies compounded by resistance to reform and systemic corruption created stagnation, which hindered technological innovation and industrial competitiveness. By the 1980s, the cumulative effects of these challenges were undeniable. The economy was underperforming, living standards lagged behind those of many industrialized nations, and public dissatisfaction was rising. Leaders recognized that maintaining the status quo was no longer viable, but attempts to implement meaningful reform were often inconsistent, partial, and politically constrained. It was within this context that Mikhail Gorbachev introduced perestroika and glasnost, initiatives aimed at restructuring the economy and increasing transparency, which, while ambitious, ultimately revealed both the depth of systemic flaws and the limits of reform within an entrenched authoritarian framework. China, under Maoist governance and later under Deng Xiaoping, illustrates a different path, one in which partial reform allowed a communist state to endure by selectively incorporating market mechanisms. After the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, the inefficiencies, famines, and social upheaval forced leaders to acknowledge the necessity of adaptation. Deng's reforms, beginning in the late 1970s, decentralized economic decision-making, introduced elements of private enterprise, and opened China to global trade while maintaining the political control of the Communist Party. This pragmatic approach allowed the nation to maintain the ideological framework of communism while alleviating some of the economic stagnation that had plagued it for decades. By blending elements of the market with central oversight, China demonstrated that partial reform, when implemented with careful control, could revitalize a struggling economy without fully abandoning the foundational principles of the state. Across Eastern Europe, the late 20th century provides further examples of how systemic failure under rigid communism precipitated collapse. Countries such as Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia faced economic stagnation, shortages, and growing social unrest. Attempts at incremental reform were often insufficient to address the deep-seated structural challenges, and public demand for change ultimately led to sweeping political transformations. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War marked the culmination of decades of accumulated inefficiencies. resistance to adaptation, and the human consequences of authoritarian governance. In these contexts, the incorporation of market mechanisms or the transition to mixed economies was not simply a policy choice. It became a necessity for survival and modernization, highlighting the limits of purely ideological models in a dynamic and interconnected world. These case studies are not just political or economic lessons, they also illuminate the human dimension of systemic transformation. Citizens living under stagnant systems often endured hardship for years or decades, and the eventual collapse or partial reform represented both opportunity and uncertainty. Families, workers, and communities who had navigated shortages, inefficiency, and political repression suddenly found themselves in societies experimenting with new economic freedoms. Private enterprise and market competition. The shift required not only structural change but a reorientation of social and cultural expectations. As citizens adapted to environments in which individual initiative and innovation were rewarded rather than constrained, the transition itself was often turbulent, revealing both the resilience and adaptability of human societies, even after prolonged periods of systemic rigidity. The interplay between ideology and pragmatism in these transformations underscores a recurring theme. While communism sought to create equality, collective prosperity, and social cohesion, the practical challenges of governance, human motivation, and adaptability ultimately demanded compromises. Full ideological purity proved difficult to maintain in the face of economic inefficiency, stagnation, and global competition. Collapse or partial reform became a mechanism through which nations could survive, demonstrating that systems, no matter how theoretically sound or ideologically inspiring, must contend with human behavior. Technological change and the realities of a complex world. By tracing these historical arcs, we can see the trajectory of communism as a cautionary tale about the limits of centralized control and rigid ideology. The failures and transformations of the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe reveal that even the most ambitious social experiments cannot ignore the interplay between policy, human incentives, and adaptability. They highlight the importance of flexibility, transparency, and responsiveness in governance, as well as the consequences when these elements are absent or suppressed. If you are following this exploration of history, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can continue uncovering how the ideals of communism met the realities of human nature, governance, and economic forces, and how nations navigated the tension between ideology and practicality. These stories remind us that while visions of equality and collective well-being can inspire, the success and survival of any society depend equally on its ability to adapt, learn, and reform in the face of changing circumstances, offering lessons that extend far beyond the historical context of the 20th century. As we reach the conclusion of our journey through the story of communism, it is worth taking a moment to reflect on the central question that has guided this exploration. Why does an ideology rooted in idealism and the pursuit of equality so often struggle to succeed in practice? Throughout our discussion, we have traced the interplay of economic, political, and human factors that shaped the fate of communist states. From the ambitious beginnings of revolutionary movements to the complex realities of centralized control, demotivated labor, political oversight, corruption, human suffering, resistance to reform, and ultimately, systemic collapse or partial transformation. By examining these patterns, a clearer picture emerges, revealing that the challenges of communism are as much about structural and human limitations as they are about policy or ideology. At its communism seeks to create a society in which wealth, power, and opportunity are distributed fairly, where collective well-being is prioritized, and where exploitation is eliminated. In theory, this vision is compelling, evoking ideals of justice, solidarity, and shared prosperity. Yet, as we have seen, the practical implementation of such ideals encounters multiple obstacles. Centralized planning, while intended to allocate resources efficiently and equitably, often struggles with misallocation and inefficiency, as local conditions and individual needs are difficult to predict from a distant bureaucratic center. The lack of personal incentives for workers and managers reduces motivation and innovation, limiting productivity and stifling creative solutions. Political control and censorship, while designed to preserve ideological cohesion, restrict freedom of thought, expression, and initiative, creating societies in which conformity is prioritized over ingenuity. Corruption and abuse of power emerge naturally in centralized systems, as officials navigate enormous authority without sufficient oversight. These structural challenges, intertwined with human behavior, reveal the difficulty of translating idealism into tangible, sustainable outcomes. Historical examples underscore these realities vividly. In the Soviet Union, rigid planning and authoritarian enforcement led to famines, purges, and inefficiencies that affected millions of citizens. Maoist China experienced similar tragedies during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, when the combination of ambitious policies, lack of flexibility, and centralized control produced widespread suffering. Eastern European states faced stagnation and social unrest, ultimately necessitating either collapse or partial reform to incorporate market mechanisms and revitalize their economies. Each case illustrates a recurrent theme. The tension between ideological ambition and practical governance often produces outcomes that contradict the very goals the system was designed to achieve. Yet beyond the structural explanations, human limitations play an equally important role. Societies are composed of individuals with varying motivations, knowledge, and capabilities. A system that assumes uniform compliance, honoring loyalty, and universal selflessness is bound to encounter friction, error, and adaptation challenges. Fear, self-interest, and survival instincts influence behavior in ways that centralized planning and strict ideology cannot fully control. Even well-intentioned leaders and citizens are subject to these human dynamics, which, when combined with structural rigidity, amplify inefficiencies, inequities, and unintended consequences. The reflection that emerges from this history is not merely a critique but a lesson in the complexity of organizing societies. Idealism alone guarantees success. The best intentions require mechanisms that account for human behavior, incentivize productivity, encourage innovation, allow feedback, and permit adaptation when circumstances change. The experiences of communist states illustrate that the balance between vision and pragmatism, between principle and flexibility, is delicate and essential. Ignoring either side of this balance, whether through rigid enforcement of ideology or through disregard for structural realities, increases the likelihood of failure. At the same time, these historical narratives offer insight into resilience, learning, and adaptation. Countries that survived the crisis of communism did so not by abandoning all ideals, but by adjusting their structures to accommodate human behavior, market realities, and technological change. China's reforms under Deng Xiaoping, for example, demonstrate how selective adaptation can preserve ideological continuity while revitalizing society economically and socially. Such examples remind us that the failure of communism is not a simple rejection of its ideals, but an illustration of the intricate interplay between human nature, governance, and structural design. As we close this reflection, It is important to acknowledge the human dimension of these stories. Millions of lives were affected by policies that were ambitious but often flawed. And the lessons of history are enriched by remembering the experiences of those who lived through these times. Understanding the successes and failures of communism offers a broader perspective on how societies function, how power is exercised, and how ideals must contend with the realities of human behavior and structural complexity. Thank you so much for listening and following along on this journey through history. If you found this exploration insightful, please give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments so we can continue uncovering more lessons from the past together. Your support helps us create more content that dives deep into the complexities of history, society, and human nature. And now, as the day comes to a close, I wish you a peaceful and restful night. Sleep well, and may tomorrow bring clarity, curiosity, and inspiration. Good night.